Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, and welcome back to the podcast. I hope you guys are having a good day so far. I've been cleaning some stuff out and getting ready for a yard sale, so it's been a semi-productive day around here. But on today's episode of the podcast, we're going to be covering another Nancy Drew book from the original mystery stories, book number 105, The Clue in the Antique Trunk. Now, this is not to be confused with book number 17, The Mystery of the Brass-Bound Trunk. The titles sound really similar, but I'm happy to report that the stories are nothing alike. Nancy doesn't go on a steamer ship in this book, and there's definitely no meteorites that fall from the sky. So this book came out in 1992, and that's very evident when you look at the book cover. The fashion that Nancy is wearing, we've got to talk about it. So there are actually two versions of this book cover, and it's been a minute since we've had that with any of the books that we've been talking about. But this first edition, this is one that I have in my own collection, but the book itself is blue and pink. I love the color combo. And Nancy is wearing a blue sweater over a collared shirt, but if you look really close at her pants, she's wearing stirrup pants, which were such a 90s thing. I remember wearing these when I was a young kid, but basically for any of you that weren't around during that time period, what are stirrup pants? They basically were like leggings, except a little bit more pants-like. They were nicer, and they had this strip of fabric at the end, which you would put under the heel of your foot. It was to keep your pants from riding up at the ankle. She's also wearing ballet flats. But I was like zooming in on the cover and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm pretty sure she's wearing stirrup pants. And then in the background behind her, we see another character. Her name is Julie. She's passed out on the floor. She's wearing jeans, tennis shoes, and a pink shirt. But surrounding Julie are all these articles that have fallen out of this trunk. And it looks like the room has been torn apart, which this is a direct scene from the book. But even if you zoom in on the canisters, the kitchen canisters in the background behind Nancy, they have these little flowers painted on them in like green and pink. Like that looks like a 90s kitchen to me. I know it's supposed to be Vera's workshop, another character in the book, but it looks like a kitchen to me. And there is a tagline on this book cover, and it says, "Old secrets hold new dangers for Nancy Drew." Now, the second edition of this book cover, it's green. This is one of the 2000s book covers where they redid them. We have Nancy in the foreground wearing a pink sweater, and then we have another miniature Nancy in the background. She's examining Julie. She's laying on the floor. And on the left side of the book, we have the trunk with all of these things spilled out of it. Overall, it's a pretty cool book cover. Now, as far as a funny cover spoof goes, I just decided to go with, "Here lies Julie Bergson. The junk in her trunk finally did her in." Sometimes these just write themselves. I mean, it was either that or spring cleaning gone wrong. But that did not make sense to me because this book takes place in winter, which we've had a lot of the mystery stories taking place in the winter months lately, which I kind of enjoy because it's really hot where I live right now. Also, don't worry, Julie Bergson is okay. She does not die, although there are some darker elements to this book. So I will go ahead and put a content warning. This book actually does deal with a pretty graphic murder from about 50 years ago. So if that doesn't seem like your thing, feel free to skip this episode. Honestly though, I didn't think it was too bad. It did surprise me being in the original mystery stories, but I kind of liked the darker elements in this one because I honestly thought we weren't going to deal with any kind of murders at all until we got to the files. Because in some of the titles for the files, they'll have like the words death, murder, fatal. They just sound a lot more intense, and they were written for an older teenage audience. So I think there will be a lot more dark storylines when we get to that series. Now, as far as giving this book cover a rating, I would give it 4.5 magnifying glasses. I like the details they included in this one. There's a lot going on. We see the trunk, we see Julie in the background, and I love Nancy's outfit. I think we should bring stirrup pants back. Who's with me? I need your help. I can't do this on my own. We ride at dawn! Okay, so now before we get started, I'll list off the characters that we encounter in The Clue in the Antique Trunk. So first up is Vera Alexander. That is who Nancy, Bess, and George are visiting in Massachusetts. She has an assistant named Julie Bergson. There's also Rosalind Chaplin. She's a real estate developer in the town of White Falls, Massachusetts. She has a dog. Her name is Fifi. There's also Grace Shane and her nephew Mike Shane. They have a relative that would be Mike's grandfather, Charlie Shane. There is Zach Calder, who was the murder victim back 50 years ago. Esther Gray, who is a long-gone poet from the area. Trisha Owens, a farm owner. Officer Margaret Conroy, and Rosemary Norris, who is over the town council. Okay, so now before we get started, I'll read a synopsis for The Clue in the Antique Trunk. In a town as pretty as a picture postcard, Nancy seeks the key to a picture-perfect crime. Nancy has come to White Falls, Massachusetts to visit her former neighbor, Vera Alexander. The town is rich in history, and Vera wants to preserve a piece of its past, but her plan to convert the old Calder Cutlery factory into a museum turns suddenly ugly and ominous when someone threatens her life. Why was Vera's antique trunk stolen? What dark secrets has she unwittingly disturbed? The answers are hidden in the past. 50 years ago, the owner of Calder Cutlery was killed by his own knife, and Nancy knows that before she can solve the present-day case, she must first uncover the haunting truth behind an old-fashioned murder. And now for a dramatically read newspaper headline synopsis. 50-year-old cold case in White Falls solved, thanks to Nancy Drew. Okay, let's jump into this book. So our book starts with Nancy, Bess, and George getting off a bus they've taken from Boston to White Falls, Massachusetts. The descriptions from the book make it sound like Stars Hollow from Gilmore Girls. There's a rambling wooden inn, several old-fashioned storefronts, a white church with a spire, and there's a river nearby. Nancy says they're there to visit her friend and an old neighbor, Vera Alexander, who left River Heights 2 years earlier when she inherited a house from her great aunt in White Falls. There's a traditional crafts fair going on too. Nancy says Vera was vague about it, but she also mentions someone might be trying to sabotage the fair. As they get off the bus, Bess says she feels like she stepped into an old New England painting, and in true George fashion, she has to yuck her cousin's yum and asks if Nancy can do something with Bess. But Vera shortly shows up and she's excited to see them, and she chats about the fair while helping them load their suitcases into her van. She says the fair should be fun and there will be a maple syrup boil, a crafts workshop, and an auction. It will be fun, she says, if the fair doesn't get ruined. So I was only a few pages into this mystery and I was invested. I don't know what it is about the New England area, the East Coast. It just sounds really quaint and charming to me. And who doesn't like a crafts fair? And if there's antiques of any kind involved, I'm gonna be there. And that's one thing I also want to point out about this book. This book, from the very beginning, the name of the title, maybe just because it reminded me of Mystery of the Brass-Bound Trunk, the synopsis on the back of the book, and then just the first few pages of the book, it felt like a classic Nancy Drew novel. And when I say classic, I mean the first 56 books. And Nancy solving a mystery in a little small town, even though it's not River Heights, it is a smaller town. I don't know, do you ever get that feeling when you first start a book, you're like, a few paragraphs in, I can tell if I'm gonna like this book or not like this book? I had a very strong feeling that I was going to love this book. Anyways, after the girls drive off with Vera in her van, she explains that she started getting these threatening phone calls after she made her plans known for what she was going to do with the funds raised from the craft fair. Vera tells them she wants to open up a museum about the local people and the town's history. And the person on the phone keeps telling her that if she doesn't back off the project, someone will make sure her museum never opens. So Nancy asks if she has any suspicions about who's been calling, and Vera says it wouldn't surprise her if it's Rosalind Chaplin, a real estate developer in White Falls. She says she's more concerned about making a buck than preserving White Falls heritage. The building Vera wants to use is one Roz has had her eyes on for a set of ski condos. But Vera says the town voted in favor of the museum, and Roz has been mad at her ever since. While they're driving across a bridge, Bess oohs and ahs over a beautiful stone building that's perched over the river and covered with ivy. It sits above a waterfall. Vera says that's the building the museum is going to go in. She says there's a ton of history there and there was even a murder in the building. This makes George more interested and Bess more scared. But Vera tells them it used to be the Calder Cutlery knife factory, and the owner, Zach Calder, was stabbed to death in his office with one of his own knives. The police never found out who did it. So Vera eventually pulls up to her house, which is this beautiful older style home, and she says her assistant, who has been helping her with the fair, Julie Bergson, must still be there working on things because her car is in the driveway. They all go inside and they find Vera's workshop has been ransacked, and Julie is laying unconscious next to an overturned trunk. So Nancy and Vera run forward to check on Julie, and Nancy feels her pulse. Julie slowly comes to and seems afraid at first until she sees Vera. But then she says the black lacquered chest that was donated last week is gone. Vera tells the girls she stored incredibly valuable quilts in it that were well over $1,000 each. Now, as someone who sells antiques, this is very accurate. Quilts are super valuable because of the time and the craftsmanship that goes into them. I'm not personally into them, but they are very collectible. But while they're all searching the room, George also notices that there's a cast iron rooster weather vane laying near Julie, and that may be what Julie was hit in the head with. Julie has been rubbing her head a lot. So Bess and George help Julie to the couch, and Vera goes to make them some hot chocolate. Nancy stays back to look around the room for more clues. So while Nancy's looking around, she sees a dolly standing next to the door, and she notices the wheels are wet, almost as if it's been out in the snow recently. So she goes outside and she follows the tracks to where they stop at the driveway. She deduces that whoever stole the trunk must have loaded it into a car and driven off with it. Nancy also notes that the hedges near Vera's house are tall, so the neighbors probably didn't see anything. But Nancy goes back inside and she surveys the mess the thief left behind, and she figures that was done to intimidate Vera. One weird thing stands out to me though. The thief returned the dolly to a spot beside the door. That's a very considerate thief. If you were trying to steal something, you would want to get away quickly. Why bother returning the dolly to a certain location after you knocked someone unconscious and ransacked a room? And was the ransacking done after Julie was knocked out? During a scuffle, or did Julie interrupt the thief while they were ransacking? There's definitely an inconsistency there. The ransacking suggests someone desperate, but the dolly being returned almost suggests that the person is familiar with using it, which is really strange. It would help to know the order of events. Okay, so a few sentences later, Nancy notices this exact same thing that I noticed, and I felt so proud of myself. Nancy herself is wondering why the dolly was returned to the door too, so that has to be an important clue. I just love the little details, and I love criminal profiling. I love knowing why people do the things that they do, so I'm always looking for those little inconsistencies in the mysteries. There's always a reason behind someone's actions. It may not be a logical reason, but it's there. So Nancy goes back inside, and Vera says she feels bad about Julie being hurt in her house because she's had a, quote, hard life. She tells Nancy that Julie ran with a rough crowd in high school, but she's in her 20s now and that's far behind her. While they're looking around the workroom again, Nancy notices a nick in the doorframe and what looks like some black covering stuck to the doorframe. She asks Vera if that was there before, and she says no, she painted the doorframe this morning. So there was a fairly fresh coat of yellow paint on the door that's now nicked. So everyone sits down with some hot chocolate around Julie, and Nancy asks if she remembers anything. Julie says she was logging things on the computer, and then next thing she knows, she was waking up on the floor. She didn't even hear the door open. Now later that night, they all go to a barn dance. Nancy and George take a break from dancing with their partners. Vera is dancing, and Julie is sitting near the stage. Bess is by the refreshments, and George makes the crack, "Where else would she be?" I don't know, George. Maybe as far as humanly possible from you, 'cause you're mean." But Nancy, meanwhile, notices an 11-year-old boy being pushed up on stage by an older woman to play the harmonica. She can tell he does not want to be up there. So Nancy and George go over to Bess, and while George and Bess share a snack, Nancy goes to get her and George something to drink. When she's grabbing cups, something yaps at her. It's a poodle named Fifi, who is wearing a red plaid outfit, and she gets scooped up by her owner, Rosalind Chaplin. Rosalind says the crafts fair is silly, and Vera is just a nosy newcomer, and White Falls doesn't need a stupid museum. Then she walks off. Which also, Fifi is such a stereotypical poodle name. That was the name of the poodle in number 103, The Stranger in the Shadows. Nancy encounters this poodle in the line at the post office. But the girls are enjoying the refreshments, but then Nancy sees some loose hay falling on Vera from the hayloft above her. So she looks up, and then a hay bale starts to fall towards Vera. Nancy yells a warning and knocks her out of the way. And Nancy doesn't stop there. She's on her feet again, and she runs up to the hayloft to see if anyone is up there. But no one seems to be around. She does spot a door that's open, though, and a ladder is propped up against the outside of the barn, so that's how the person escaped. George comes up to the hayloft a few seconds later, and she finds a harmonica in the straw, kind of like the one that little boy was playing on the stage a few minutes ago. But Nancy kind of scans the crowd in the barn, and she notices Rosalind Chaplin acting weird near the entrance to the barn. She keeps looking at Vera, and her dog is covered in hay. Then she just leaves. Yeah, that's not suspicious at all. Now the next day, everyone helps clean up the mess at Vera's house. Julie asks Nancy if she thinks Roz is out to get Vera, and Nancy says maybe. She's not sure yet. But Nancy takes the time to ask Vera about the harmonica player, and Vera says his name is Mike Shane. She says she hired him to run errands a few months ago, but then Julie jumps in and says he was stealing from Vera, so he was fired. Vera gave him money for errands, and he wasn't bringing all her change back. Vera tells Nancy that Mike lives with his aunt and uncle, and his parents died in a plane crash. Mike works at their family's general store. Nancy also gets the address for Roz's office, and Vera says she can borrow the car to go over there. She also mentions some local sites like the house of this old poet, Esther Gray. But just as they're about to leave, Bess picks up a leather book with the initials ZC on it. Zach Calder, maybe? And Julie snatches it back from her, then apologizes. She says they're inventory entries she has to log into the computer. But Vera says it won't hurt for Bess to look at it and takes it from Julie to give to Bess. She says it's Zach Calder's diary, so Julie was lying. But Bess tucks it into her purse to read later, and then they leave. And Julie looks upset about it. So next, Nancy, Bess, and George go to Shane's general store, and they see Mike is behind the soda counter, and he has his harmonica. So the girls order milkshakes, and Nancy casually says they saw him playing harmonica the night before and he's really good. Mike says his aunt made him and he lost his harmonica and had to buy another one. So Nancy pulls out the one she and George found in the hayloft and tells him where she found it. Mike says someone stole it from him, but Nancy says Vera almost had a hay bale fall on her, and Mike says it's too bad it missed her because she's ruining everything with the dumb crafts fair. Nancy says he doesn't seem to like Vera much, and he says it's none of her business, but Vera needs to stay away from Calder cutlery. So Nancy next asks if Mike is talking about Vera's plans to make the old factory a museum, and then he just storms off. A few seconds later, Mike's aunt, Grace Shane, comes over and apologizes for his behavior. She says Mike's father and her husband were brothers, and Mike has been a, quote, trial to them lately. I'm going to use that phrase next time someone is testing me. You know what? You've been a trial for me lately. You've been testing my patience. But Grace goes on to say Mike has been skipping school, shirking his chores at the store, and disappearing at odd hours with no explanation. She says he's following in his grandfather Charlie Shane's footsteps, and he was a bad apple. She says it was never proven, but everyone knows he's the one who killed Zach Calder. Okay, hold the phone. We didn't know that, but now we do. And literally the next note that I wrote down is, ooh, this town has some dark gossip. I love storylines like this. Maybe it's the contrast between the quaint little town and this dark crime that rocked it to its core. But I really enjoy stories where the main character finds themselves in this little general store, they're drinking a milkshake, and then the owner just decides to fill them in on all the town's dark lore and founding family drama. I know that's a very specific formula, but add in a lost treasure and I'm set. So Nancy pries a little bit further, but Grace is like, oop, shouldn't have told you that. She says Charlie was her husband's father and she hopes he never comes back. But she says the night Zach was murdered, Charlie was seen leaving the factory. Then he left town. So Grace says it was as good as admitting that he did it. But then, of course, Grace gets a customer and she has to rush off, so the girls pay and leave with their milkshakes. We got just a little taste of the dark history of this town. But Bess says she would rather read Zach's diary than go to Roz's office because that's what Nancy had planned for them next. So they plan to reconvene later. So Bess goes off to read Zach's diary and Nancy and George head off to Roz's. They wonder if maybe Mike has a motive for preventing the museum project because he doesn't want his grandfather to be cast in a bad light. That would be pretty tough to be in this small town where everyone knows you and you have this distant relative, or really not that distant, it's his grandfather who committed this really bad crime. There would kind of be like this black mark on you, I would feel like. It's kind of that trope of like everybody whispers about you and they cross the street when they see you coming. But anyways, Nancy and George arrive at Roz's real estate office and she's telling a man with a notepad things they need to do. When she sees them, she isn't pleased. Nancy asks if they could have a minute of her time and Roz says she's busy, but Nancy says it won't take long. So Nancy starts by saying that Vera has been receiving some threats and had a hay bale pushed down on her at the barn dance, and she asks if Roz knows anything about that. Roz just says she's glad she's not the only one who opposes the museum, but the hay bale thing was probably just an accident. So Nancy brings up the stolen trunk of quilts, and all Roz has to say to that is that she doesn't have to resort to those kinds of tactics, and her projects are far more successful than Vera's will ever be. Roz wants to modernize White Falls, and Nancy says, you mean by destroying beautiful old buildings? And Roz claps back and says her family has lived in the area since the 1700s, and her relatives are world famous. She's as proud of her history as anyone, but White Falls needs to look to the future, not the past. So the man who was taking notes and orders from Roz earlier comes in and says the ski condo furniture has arrived, and Nancy asks if they can tag along to see it. Roz seems annoyed by this, but she says yes. But while she's barking orders at the furniture movers, Nancy hears Roz's poodle Fifi growling, and she finds her pulling on a quilt and trying to get it out of a black trunk. Oh, okay. You don't have to resort to those sorts of tactics, do you? But Nancy wants to see if there's yellow paint on the trunk that matches the nick in Vera's doorway, therefore proving that it is the same trunk that came from Vera's. But Roz comes over to scold Fifi, and she asks what this old thing is doing there, holding up a scrap of the ripped quilt, and then she spots the trunk. Then she looks at Nancy and George, and it's like she can't get them out of there fast enough. She ushers them out, saying she's incredibly busy, and they need to go. But as Nancy and George leave, Nancy says it almost seemed like Roz was surprised to see the trunk there. But if she knew it was out there, why even let the girls go out there? So Nancy tables this for later, and back at Vera's, Nancy, Bess, and George get ready to walk to where the maple boil is going on, bundling up in jeans, sweaters, gloves, and scarves since it's cold. Julie and Vera left earlier after lunch. But Bess is taking too long, and when she comes downstairs, she tells them she got caught up in reading Zach's diary. She says at first it was boring, just logs for the factory, but now it's getting juicy. Bess says Zach wrote about being wooed by a mystery woman who left flowers and an anonymous love note in his car. So the girls walk through the snow to the maple boil at Owen's maple farm, and Vera is showing some kids how to pour the hot syrup into shapes that will harden into maple sugar on the snow. And she's showing them historic pictures of maple boils from the past. She tells Nancy, Bess, and George that Julie went back to the house to do some more computer work. And she also says Trisha Owens is making pancakes to go with the maple syrup. Now about this time, Nancy spots Mike Shane skulking around the edges of the festivities, glaring at Vera, but when he sees Nancy, he takes off running and she chases after him. He leads her to the Calder Cutlery factory. So Nancy follows his footprints and they just stop at a wall. She feels around beneath the ivy and she finds a window she's able to open and climb into the factory. She sees stairs going up and stairs going down, so she chooses to go down. Mike isn't down there, but as she starts to go back upstairs, she hears a clatter and sees a rusty metal bin hurtling down the staircase towards her. A step goes out under Nancy as she tries to get out of the way. If she doesn't move, the bin will crash down on her. So Nancy uses her apparently ingrained gymnast skills and she tucks and rolls out of the way of this barrel. She gets up the stairs a few seconds later after the barrel rolls past her, just in time to see Mike climbing out the window. Nancy yells at him to stop, but of course he doesn't listen. Nancy's also rubbing her hip a little, it hurts, as she hears George's voice calling to her from outside the factory. Bess is out there too. Nancy looks around her and she doesn't understand why Mike would be hanging around the factory. It's not like Vera has started renovations yet, so there's nothing for him to ruin. But then Nancy hears a third voice outside join Bess and George and a key unlocking a door, and Julie Bergson is with them. Bess and George explain they got worried when they couldn't find Nancy, and Nancy tells them about Mike pushing the barrel at her. Julie says she hasn't seen anyone around the property except herself, Vera, and the inspectors. She says it isn't safe for Mike to be in the factory though, and she's going to nail the windows shut, and tell Vera so they can have a talk with Mike. So Nancy turns to Julie and she asks if she knows why Mike wouldn't want Vera to renovate Calder Cutlery, and Julie shrugs and says maybe he's mad Vera told his aunt and uncle he stole money from her, or maybe he just likes to play in the factory. Nancy says Mike was running from her though and didn't seem like he was playing. So Bess changes the subject and she asks what Julie is doing there since Vera had told them she was doing computer work. Julie says Vera needed some measurements for the architect and she holds up a tape measure. Julie then says they should go have fun at the maple boil when Nancy volunteers to stay behind and help. And Bess starts geeking out about how they're in the same place where Zach Calder was killed because she's gotten very invested in his diary. So Julie points out his office upstairs. Bess starts to go up there, but Julie yells to stop. And then she explains that Vera doesn't want anyone going up the stairs until they're reinforced. So George says Nancy should go get her hip looked at anyway, and Julie says they can borrow her car. She says she'll tell Vera where they went. So Nancy goes to the doctor at George's insistence. She really does not want to go, and they have to wait over an hour to be seen because a lot of people in town have the flu. But they later leave, and George is cut off by a police car going towards Vera's house. So when Nancy, Bess, and George get to her house, Vera is talking to a policewoman. She says it's happened again. Another trunk, this time with vintage clothes, has been stolen. So Vera is fuming and she says she knows Roz is behind this and says she's going to go confront her right now. Nancy advises her against this, though, because she says it would only cause bad publicity for the museum and the crafts fair. Now, the policewoman, Officer Margaret Conroy, says it doesn't look like there's any sign of forced entry, but she asks why Vera suspects Roz. Vera sheepishly tells her about the first trunk being stolen and says she hasn't had time to report it. Nancy also explains that she and George think they saw the trunk at Roz's office the other day, but they're not 100% sure and don't want to make a false accusation. Officer Conroy says they'll just make sure there is an officer at every crafts event from here on out, and then she leaves. Now later that night, Nancy is on the couch because that's what the doctor recommended for her hip, and Bess and George are hanging out with her. Vera is getting ready to leave for her talk on the museum project, and Julie already came by, got her car, and headed that way. Vera says Julie has been such a great friend and has kept her organized the last few months. She also says Julie taking the measurements for the architects, even though she didn't ask her to, is just like her to do because she's so efficient. So after saying this, Vera leaves and the girls settle down for a night in. Bess reads them a poem from Zach's diary from the mystery woman, and it says, "Oh, to find a soul so sweet, two hearts moved by a single beat. O brightest star, I need no light but thee. Thy love and mine shall bind us for eternity." Bess says she would love for a guy to write her a poem like that. But Nancy says she wonders if the mystery woman could have been Esther Gray. Bess says maybe. Esther never married, and she flips back to another entry and reads, and it says, "My secret admirer must think I'm a fool. She writes of love and marriage. She's no better than the others. What she truly loves is not me, but the money I have worked so hard for." Wow, Zach Calder seems a little bit paranoid. And others? How many people were with this guy? So Bess goes on to read another entry that says, "My secret admirer tells me that if she can't marry me, then no one else shall. I now fear for my life." George says she thinks Zach was paranoid, but Bess reads on. The next part of the entry says, "Her scheme will not succeed. I won't allow her or anyone else to cheat me out of my riches. My money is hidden where no banks or lawyers or other money grubbers will ever find it. If need be, the secret of my money chest will die with me." You know, for somebody who doesn't want someone else to find their money and their stuff, this guy sure does go on in his diary, which is great for people in future generations, but also kind of stupid on his part. But Bess thinks the mystery woman killed Zach, and George thinks Charlie Shane did it. That's when Nancy has an epiphany. Maybe someone isn't trying to sabotage Vera's craft fair and museum. Maybe the person has read Zach Calder's diary and is trying to find Zach's hidden fortune. So George says Vera and Julie have both read the diary, but she and Nancy both agree that Roz and Mike seem like more likely candidates. So they decide to go in the workroom and poke around. Nancy decides to check the computer inventory. So she types in the word diary to test it out, and all kinds of entries pop up for diaries, memoirs, and letters donated for the museum. Nancy is able to find out Zach Calder's diary was donated March 1st, a week ago. Bess points out, though, that anyone could have read the diary since it was at the town hall before being donated. But George sees an entry in the computer saying a black lacquered captain's trunk was also donated, and a lot of the trunks and things donated came from the Calder factory. So Nancy wonders if Mike could have been skulking around the factory trying to find the trunk with the money in it. Nancy also doesn't get why, if someone has been after the money, why they would be still sabotaging Vera. It seems more personal. But Nancy also takes note of who facilitated the donations from the factory, and it was Rosemary Norris, a woman on the town council. So the next day, the girls go to take a tour of Esther Gray's house led by Rosemary Norris. She shows them and several other tourists where Esther wrote her poetry. Rosemary says Esther was a private person and lived in the house from 42 until her death at 78 years old. A lot of her poetry, although she never married, was about being in love. So George asks who the poems are about, and Rosemary says scholars have debated that for decades, but no one knows for sure who Esther was writing about. George points out a poem that almost has the exact same wording as the poem in Zach Calder's diary, and Bess says Esther had to be the mystery woman. So after the tour is over, the girls talk to Rosemary, and she's surprised when Nancy tells her about the poem in Zach Calder's diary that sounds exactly like something Esther could have written. Nancy asks if she saw the diary since it was in some of the things that were donated to Vera, and Rosemary admits she didn't pay too much attention to any of it. She says the dust was undisturbed in the closet where all the things were stored when Vera and her assistant, a young boy, came to look at it. So she's talking about Mike Shane. So Bess says later that she left the diary at Vera's, but she can bring it back so Rosemary can see it, and then they leave. Now next, Nancy lets Bess and George go back to Vera's to get the diary to show Miss Norris while she goes to the local paper, the White Falls Gazette, to research Zach Calder's death. Someone sets her up with the microfilm, and when Nancy goes back to the year Zach was killed and the date, August 16th, the headline reads, "Mystery Murder, Local Tycoon Found Dead." So the murder occurred 50 years ago, but the following articles mentioned Charlie Shane being spotted the night of the murder, and then about how he left town. There's also an article talking about Zach's missing fortune. So Nancy looks at the article again about Zach's murder, and there's a picture of him with the article, where he's sitting in his office while he was alive. Nancy studies it closely, and something about it seems so familiar to her. She also sees a memorial notice in the paper for Zach, and names are listed with it. Names of people who had helped get it in the paper. The Gray family is listed, and more specifically, Esther Gray and Rosalind Gray Chaplin. So Rosalind Chaplin is related to Esther Gray, but the Rosalind Gray Chaplin in the newspaper article must be Roz's mother or grandmother, and she's named after them. So the next day, Nancy, Bess, and George share their findings with Vera and Julie over lunch. Vera seems shocked about the missing money being a possible motivator, but Julie seems skeptical. They all finish eating, and Vera says they need to hurry and go to the crafts workshop. Julie says she'll work on some more computer inventory, but Vera says no, they're all going to go have fun. It's also brought up that Bess couldn't find Zach Calder's diary the other day, and she could have sworn she left it by the bed. So they all head to the crafts fair, and Nancy spots Gray Shane there. She goes over and asks some questions about Mike, like where he spends his time, and she says the only time Mike comes home is to eat and sleep. But before Nancy can ask too many questions, though, there's a loud argument across the room between Vera and Roz. Roz says Vera has gone too far, and Vera says, no, you've gone too far. Roz says she doesn't have to take this, though, and Vera won't get away with it. She also says if Vera crosses her again, she'll regret it. So she stomps off, and Nancy goes over to Vera and asks what's going on. Vera says she has no idea, but Roz just makes her mad. Julie comes over about this time, and she says she knew Roz was trouble, and this is proof she's trying to sabotage them. So Nancy next asks Vera if she can borrow her van. She wants to see if they can spot the trunk at Roz's again. So Vera gives her the keys, and Nancy goes to grab George from the woodworking station and Bess from the glass-blowing booth. So they go to Roz's, and the plan is for Bess to pretend to want a condo to distract Roz. Roz hasn't seen Bess, so she won't be suspicious. So Bess goes in her office while Nancy uses a lock-picking kit to get her and George into the garage where they saw the trunk. They look around and they find not one, but 2 trunks, and one has yellow paint on it. But then they hear Roz and Bess coming. Roz turns the lights on, and she instantly sees them. So naturally, Roz is furious once she realizes Bess was distracting her. She says they're trespassing and she's going to call the police. But then Nancy tells her to go ahead and call them, because the police will be very interested to know that Roz is the one who's been sabotaging Vera. But Roz claims to not know what they're talking about. But George throws the tarp off of the 2 trunks. Instead of confessing, though, Roz gets even more mad at them and says Vera put them up to this. Nancy is baffled by this because Roz does not sound like someone who has been caught in the act. So finally, Roz sighs and says she thinks they need to come inside to talk. So she leads them into her office and picks Fifi up and puts her in her lap. She says at the barn dance the other night, Fifi stole Mike's harmonica and went up in the barn's loft, and she had to chase after her. Aren't there usually ladders going up into barns? Like, how did Fifi get up there? But anyways, Fifi stole this harmonica, let me suspend my disbelief, and Roz says she slipped in the hay trying to get the harmonica away from Fifi, and that's when she accidentally knocked the hay bale out of the loft. She says her heels were ruined. And then Bess snaps, who cares about a dumb pair of shoes? Vera could have been hurt. And Roz insists it was an accident and says people in town know about her and Vera's rivalry, and she thought no one would believe it was an accident, so she snuck down a back ladder from the loft. As for the trunks, Roz says they just showed up in her garage bay. She went to the crafts workshop to confront Vera about it because she thinks she put them there, to make her look guilty. So Nancy listens to all of this, and she kind of believes Roz. After all, she was surprised when she saw the first trunk the other day. So she decides to test Roz and see if she knows about Zach Calder's hidden money. So she asks if Esther Gray is a relative of hers, and Roz says she was her mother's sister. George says they toured Esther's house and couldn't help but wonder if she was in love with a mystery man. Bess continues and says someone like Zach Calder, and Roz says her aunt's poems were about an imaginary man. But Bess protests that Zach would have been a catch with all the money he had, and Roz says Zach Zach didn't even have enough money to pay his workers when he died, so apparently she doesn't know about the money. But Roz says she wants the moldy trunks out of her sight, so the girls haul them away. Nancy examines them once they're in the car to see if there are any secret compartments, but she doesn't find any. So Nancy starts to drive them back to the craft workshop when George excitedly points at the Calder Cutlery factory. There's someone roaming around in the dark on the first floor with a candle, so Nancy does a U-turn so they can go back to investigate the factory. They quietly sneak in the window Nancy used to follow Mike the other day and look around. Nancy sees some wooden boards with nails on the floor and notes how they were nailed diagonally outside the window. So Julie did come back to do that like she said she would, but Nancy is pretty sure someone from inside the factory must have removed the boards. So the girls go down to the basement and look around, and Bess says something is odd. She says from the bridge the other day looking up at the factory, it had seemed like the factory had 4 windows on the lower level, not 3. So they walk around the room, and George says the basement room doesn't seem as long as the one above it. And when Nancy goes to examine a shelf on one wall, she says it looks more narrow than some of the others next to it. So she moves her fingers along it, and all of a sudden the shelves swing in, revealing a hidden room. And the girls enter and see the candle, Mike Shane, and another person. The man asks who Nancy is, and Mike says she's Vera's nosy friend, Grandpa. So the man is Charlie Shane. So Bess blurts out asking what he's doing there after he left town after he murdered, and then she trails off. She kind of put her foot in her mouth there. But Charlie says not everyone knows what they're talking about. So Nancy asks what he's doing there, and Mike tells him he doesn't have to answer them. But Charlie says maybe it's none of their business, but George says sabotaging their friend's museum is their business. Nancy also says Mike threw a metal bin at her, and Mike says he didn't want her to find his grandfather. But Nancy also deduces that's why Mike didn't want the museum at the Calder factory, and he stole money from Vera to help Charlie. He was getting food for him. So Nancy asks Charlie to tell them what happened the night Zach Calder was murdered. And Bess asks if Esther murdered Zach, and Charlie says she shouldn't dare speak of Esther that way. Charlie, it turns out, loved Esther, but she only had eyes for Zach. He says he doesn't know what she saw in that cold fish. Charlie says he had seen Esther leave notes and flowers in Zach's car, but that night she went into the factory with a wild look in her eyes. He didn't know what she'd do, so he waited downstairs and overheard everything. Esther confessed to Zach that she loved him, and he laughed in her face and called her a fortune hunter. Then Charlie says he heard Zach let out a scream that chilled him to the bone, and he saw Esther coming downstairs with the knife. So Charlie took it from her and threw it in the river. Then he drove Esther home and went back to the factory to get all her letters. Dang, this is dark for the original mystery stories. But Charlie says he hid out in Canada until 2 weeks ago. He says he wanted to protect Esther. That was his primary motivation. And if people just assumed that he murdered Zach Calder, then Esther was safe. So Nancy asks if he took anything else out of Zach's office, and the man laughs and says it wasn't like there was any money sitting out. But Nancy wonders if he's telling the truth. Now later the next day, the girls tell Vera and Julie about Charlie Shane, and they can't believe it. Vera says she'll allow Charlie to stay at the factory and hopefully he can repair his relationships with his family. Julie says she wonders about the Calder fortune, not that there is one of course, and also asks Nancy if she's found out who's after it. Nancy says she still doesn't know. But then Nancy pieces something together. The carved box in the picture with Zach from the newspaper looks just like the one they saw at Esther Gray's house on the tour, and the money could be in it. So Julie excitedly says, if need be, the secret of my money chest will die with me. She quotes Zach's diary. But George says it's too bad Esther's house is closed today. But Julie starts helping Vera load things in the van and says they need to take the things over to the White Falls Inn. At this point, though, George decides to call Miss Norris. And while they're talking, Nancy asks if Bess has found Zach Calder's diary, and she says no, it still hasn't turned up. So while all of this is going on, Julie says she'll take the last pieces for the auction in her car and goes outside. George hangs up and says Mrs. Norris is going to meet them at the auction. And that's when Vera remembers the box from the picture was in some things Miss Norris donated for the auction, so it's at the inn. So Vera and Nancy get in the van, and when Nancy mentions the missing diary, Vera says Julie can help them find it. Then it all clicks. Julie hadn't wanted Bess to read the diary in the first place, or for the girls to go in Zach's office. And Julie had wanted them all to think Roz was guilty of sabotaging Vera, and she seems to know the diary backwards and forwards. So Nancy tells Vera to go back to the house, but when she tries to hit the brakes, the van keeps speeding down the road. The brake lines have been cut. so they're forced to steer into a snowbank. But when Nancy suggests that Julie could be behind everything, Vera doesn't want to believe it. But Nancy convinces her to go back to the house to check on Bess and George and call the police, while Nancy flags down a ride and gets dropped off at the White Falls Inn. Nancy goes into the auction room and grabs the chest when a voice behind her says, "Thank you, Nancy," and it's Julie, and she's holding a butcher knife. So Nancy tells her the police are coming, but Julie leads her at knife point outside, where she ties Nancy's wrists and makes her get in the back of the car with the chest. She drives them to the Calder factory, and Julie says Nancy isn't going to ruin her plan. But Nancy angrily says Vera trusted her. She was her friend, and Julie says she deserves the money. Nancy says it's not hers to take. But Julie's confessions come out one after another. She's the one who set Roz up with the trunks. And when it comes to Julie being knocked out, she says that the rooster weather vane fell on her head and knocked her out. She realized they thought someone had done that to her, so Julie just went with it. But Julie leads Nancy down to the secret room and says Charlie Shane is going to kill Nancy, just like he did Zach Calder. She pushes Nancy inside and raises her butcher knife, saying, "Say goodbye, Nancy Drew." Ugh, this is like the Nancy Drew computer games. The villains are so creepy, just like this. But Nancy says, "Aren't you going to make sure the money is in the box?" So Julie decides this is a good idea, and she gets frustrated when she sees a lock on the false bottom in it. She throws a piece of paper from the box aside, and meanwhile, Nancy sees Charlie slowly come to the doorway. But as Julie beats at the box and opens it, money can be seen. So Nancy runs out of the room, and she and Charlie lock Julie inside. The police come and arrest Julie, and Bess and George are there too. Julie had locked them in the workshop at Vera's house. Now later at the auction, Charlie is exonerated, he's proven innocent, and turns out the piece of paper in the box that Julie threw aside was a full confession from Esther that read, "To whoever may find this, I must unburden my soul of this terrible nightmare. Each night in my dreams I relive the horror. My hand raised against Zachary, the evil glimmer of the knife, the look of terror in his eyes. And then it is done. I have put out the light of Zachary's life forever. I keep hoping this vision is but a dream, but I know my love is really gone. Why must Zachary mock me like this, even in death? Today I happened upon this secret compartment with its cache of money. How worthless his fortune is to me. It cannot bring my dearest Zachary back, nor erase the emptiness of my soul. I love him still and remain in utter despair without him. Sweet Zachary, how could I have done this to you? Esther Gray." So Esther's love poems are bid on. Vera is petitioning to use Zach's money for the museum. Charlie is going to help her in the museum, and Roz helped get the things in Vera's van to the auction. But she is a little upset about the murderer being her aunt. And that's the end of the book. Okay, so now let's go on to a segment that I like to call What's Cookin'. So the mentionings of food in this book were hot chocolate, apple cider, brownies, sandwiches, vanilla and chocolate milkshakes, popcorn, soda, tomato soup, and pancakes. Now let's go on to a segment that I like to call Add That to Your Resume. So I said for this book, Nancy could add cold case solver to her resume. She solved a 50-year-old cold case, and a murder at that. Now let's talk about the things I liked and the things I didn't like about the clue in the antique trunk. So I really liked that this book felt very classic. It reminded me of some of the older Nancy Drew books, and there were some good twists and turns, and it was kind of dark. This is one of the first times that Nancy has dealt with a murder. Even though it was 50 years ago, it was a murder. And I feel like we're going to see more of that in the Nancy Drew files than in these original stories, but I kind of liked some of the darker aspects of this book. There wasn't anything I didn't like. So when it comes to giving the clue in the antique trunk a book rating, I would give it 5 magnifying glasses. This was a very good one. I know last week's episode I gave the book a 1, so this is the polar opposite. 5 magnifying glasses. I would highly recommend reading this book. So that concludes this week's episode, and for next week's episode we're going to jump into the next book, number 106, The Case of the Artful Crime. I haven't actually started reading this book yet, but I'm assuming that there will be some art galleries, maybe some
plagiarism of some sort. Maybe someone is stealing someone else's art. I guess we'll see next week. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. Can't get enough of the podcast? Then check out my subscription series, True Drew Files, available on Apple and Spotify. For Nancy Drew books and merchandise, you can check out my website, www.truedrewpodcast.com. For business inquiries, you can contact me at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on Instagram at True Drew Podcast.